Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk mostly about David and really read closely the rise of David in his career. We'll end by gesturing towards the Davidic covenant and some of the ways that it interacts with the Mosaic covenant. We'll cover that more in the next module as well, and then we'll talk about the fall of David. So we're really here going to try to get up through 2 Samuel chapter 7 from 1 Samuel chapter 18. So David is a hero, but he's also a bit of an anti-hero. We've already seen that in 1 Samuel 17, that he's got a tension that lies at the heart of him that is something similar, perhaps not in exact ways, but there's this tension that we can see that lies really in the heart of every human being. And David exemplifies that in some way, and also is perhaps exaggerates it in some way. David is a great example of this tremendous power to do good and to do harm, to have faith and courageous power that comes from a good place of wanting to serve others, and from a place of wanting to have and take. The struggle between Yahweh and Pharaoh, that lies in the heart of David, and we can see that throughout. So let me show this to you. Okay, so if we start at 1 Samuel 18, let's read this and let's think just for a moment about what if you were part of Saul's government, part of Saul's family, or Saul's political appointees, right? You see this kid, David, become a smash hit hero for the people immediately after he kills Goliath, right? And there's some rumors that he's been anointed by the prophet Samuel. And also, he is this famous musician, and people really love to hear him perform. And he makes people feel good when he plays music. And then he's also this kind of famous warrior and so on. And then, now that he's killed Goliath, you owe him a lot of money and the hand of your daughter that you've promised him. So, chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now, there's a lot of ways to read this and understand this. One way to read and understand this is to know that the verb to love in ancient Hebrew is a political word. It doesn't have to always be political, but in contexts where you're talking about kings and when a king loves someone, it hardly ever describes romantic love. This verb describes political unity or loyalty. So when kings sign treaties, right? We read about the vassal treaties in the book Hidden Riches. We read some of those vassal treaties. There's talk of love. So one king is supposed to love the vassal king is supposed to love the suzerain king, I love you like a father, right? You are my father. As they'll make these kind of family relationship metaphors, and they sound really real. A person who makes an oath or an oath of loyalty to someone who is their superior would say, I love you. And they wouldn't necessarily mean it in a romantic sense, but they could very much mean it in a political sense. We have an oath of loyalty to each other. Just like that word that means covenant loyalty, chesed, it's often translated as loving kindness, but it can sometimes include that, but really it's fierce covenant loyalty is a bit more what that's like. So Jonathan was a fierce, loyal covenant, it was in a fierce, loyal covenant relationship with David. So now this kid who's worked his way into the royal court and has become a hero of the Israelite people, now he's also made this oath of loyalty to the prince who's in line for the throne. And guess what? Princes aren't supposed to do that, right? They're supposed to. The princes are supposed to be looking out for themselves, not for this random kid who showed up from the court, right? All to say that Jonathan made a covenant with David in verse 3 because he loved him as his own soul, his own body, his own flesh, right? Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing, gave it to David, and his armor, even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. He's giving David all of the accoutrement of the prince, right? Who's in line for the throne. He's telling David, I want you to be king instead. So what if you're part of the royal family? Like, who is this kid that got the prince to outwardly symbolize that the prince doesn't even want to be king? The prince wants this other guy to be king for him, right? And then, of course, David becomes this general and does this amazing job of making the army amazing, winning all these victories and so on, and people are singing songs about him. He's like a rock star in the community. And Saul gets really angry and turns on David. And as you might expect, right? I mean, Saul is the king, but no one likes him anymore. And his own son pledged loyalty to someone else, right? So verse 10, that next day an evil spirit came upon Saul, and he tries to kill David as he's playing his music and so on. So David kind of escapes him. So this is the beginning of the tension that we see between David and Saul, and Jonathan is caught in the middle of all that. So then verse 17 of chapter 18, Saul says to David, here's my elder daughter Moab, I'll give her to you as a wife, only be valiant. And Saul thought, let the Philistines deal with him. I'm going to get this kid killed, right? But David said to Saul, well, who am I, or my kinsfolk, my father's family in Israel? Who am I that I should be the son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Saul's daughter Moab should have been gone to David, she was given to Adriel, this other guy, as a wife. So in other words, David is outwardly saying, oh, who am I to marry into the royal family? But then actually the king gets makes an alliance with someone else with his daughter's marriage, and now David's upset. So now then Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Saul was told the thing pleased him. Saul thought, well, let me give her to her. It should be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him, so I can use her as like a political leverage on him, right, to help get rid of him. So therefore Saul said to David, well, now you'll be my son-in-law. Okay, so I'll make good on the promise that I made you, right? And then Saul said, speak to David in private and say, see, the king is delighted with you and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So in other words, make sure David's going to go through with this because I'm going to get him, right? So all to say then, there's a scheme, right? That David now has to get the foreskins of 100 Philistines. He has to kill 100 Philistines and basically scalp them in a way, in order to prove to Saul that he's worth his daughter's hand, right? Thinking that David's going to die doing this by himself. He's going to fight 100 guys by himself. He's going to die. But he doesn't, right? That is to say that David comes through. He is able to succeed, and now let's imagine you're a courtier, right? You're a friend of Saul's, and you're like, now this kid is going to be married into the royal family. He's got the prince, pledging loyalty to him, and so on. Gosh, he's got his own army and so on. Then of course David runs away, right, and finds Saul's trying to kill him, right? This is an amazing thing. Where does David run to? First, David runs in the wilderness, right? But then David goes to Gath. In chapter 21, verse 10, David rose and fled that day from Saul. He went to King Achish of Gath. Do you know where Gath is? That's Philistine territory. David tries to join the Philistines. And guess what? David later on does actually become a Philistine lord, the lord of Ziklag. In chapter 27, David serves King Achish of Gath, becomes the lord of a Philistine city of Ziklag. The Philistines are the mortal enemies of the Israelites, and David becomes one of them. He becomes one of their generals. He becomes a lord of the Philistines, and he comes up with this scheme, right, where he's attacking people, pretending it's Israelites, but they're really not. But still, this would look really pretty suspicious, right? And David hides his family out, right, in Moab. In chapter 22, verse 3, David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. He said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come to you. It's not explained here, but elsewhere the book of Ruth talks about the Moabite connection. Why would David have a connection to Moab, right? His great-grandmother comes from Moab. That's not mentioned at all here, but it would look suspicious to people that David's going to Moab to hide his parents out with a rival kingdom. So now he's allies with the Philistines and the Moabites, and he's kind of fighting a little war with the Israelites and the Israelite king that God anointed. You can probably understand that people thought that he was not doing the right thing, right? Now, let me just read this to you. This is chapter 22, verse 1, verse 1 and 2. David left there and escapes to the cave of Adullam in the wilderness, right? When his brothers and father's house heard of it, they went down there to him, the house of Jesse and so on. So, because they're going to die too, right? If this guy's an enemy of the state, Saul's going to wipe them out too, so they got to get to safety. So they go to the wilderness. Everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400 men. And later on, we actually hear that he has these kind of worthless, like the word actually is worthless people in Hebrew that's used to refer to them, that are like part of his group. So in chapter 30, verse 22, all the corrupt and worthless fellows from among the men who had gone to David said. David gets these people who are in debt, discontented. Everyone who's mad at Saul gathers in the wilderness at this base that David has constructed. What do you call this? David is allying with foreign armies. And he's allying with people. He's trying to get the king's son against him and the king's daughter against him. And now he's hiding out in the wilderness, and he's raising an army full of people who are discontented, who have, first of all, I want to say that the kind of an amazing thing here, but this is ancient Israel, right? They are the people who have been gathered together, who were debt slaves, who were forced into servitude, people who were oppressed, and so on. I mean, this is the kind of core of ancient Israelite identity here. But these people are gathering to Saul. So the kingdom of Saul has already begun to create these kind of hierarchies. It's already begun to gather land. There's already like debt slaves and so on. And David presents an alternative to this. That's his positive, right? Is that David's presenting an alternative to this new kingship system. But at the same time, this would have looked like treason to anyone who would have been looking closely at the time. I want to read, with all that in mind, right? That David looks like he is he's a rebel, right? I'm going to read this story in chapter 25. Starting in verse 2, 1 Samuel 25, verse 2. This is a medieval European image here of this story here. So the story begins like this. It's the story of Nabal. There was a man in Maon whose property was in Carmel. So Carmel is this very nice area, a lot of rain there, a lot of, it's easy to farm. Carmel means garden, kind of a garden of God. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. So this really rich guy. By the way, how did this guy get so rich? Ancient Israel is supposed to maybe not have these divisions. But in any event, this really rich guy. Now, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. Now, Nabal means kind of like fool. So this guy's, not very smart. But the woman was clever and beautiful, but the man was surly and mean, and he was a Calebite. Caleb was not related to the family of Abraham. So, but here it's used as like a derogatory term, right? But in any event, so this guy is married to a very intelligent woman, but he himself is not the smartest. David had heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. Okay, so the day that you shear the sheep, now you have lots of wool, right? Which is a commodity, which means cha-ching. There's lots of money there at the time, right? David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Thus you shall salute him. Peace be to you, and peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers." I mean, I just happened to hear that the money started to roll in. I don't know where I heard that, but I just happened to hear it. And the shepherds have been with us, right? My men, all these guys with swords that are like in my army, we've noticed these sheep and these shepherds around, right? And we did them no harm, and they missed nothing. I never killed any of those shepherds or stole the sheep. So then verse 8, ask your young men, they'll tell you. So because we didn't kill any of your guys and take any of your sheep, and then he also says, therefore let my young men find favor in your sight, for we have come on a feast day. Who knew? It happened to be a feast day. There's all this food out here, all this stuff that you've rolled out here. You're about to have the party. Who knew, right? We just happened to show up. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. I don't know if you know what words like to just are used typically to describe this, but something like a shakedown. This is the kind of tactics that the mafia would use, or organized crime would use. A scheme where they tell you, it's called a protection scheme, where your restaurant has never burned down, and I've been here the whole time, so if you pay me some money, I'll make sure that your restaurant doesn't burn down. Now, no one's threatening to burn the restaurant down except for the person who wants the protection money, right? So that is to say that David is running a scheme here. When David's young men came in, they said all this to Nabal and to David, and then they waited. But Nabal answered the servants, "Who's this David guy? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are breaking away with their masters. Shall I take my bread and water and the meat I butchered for my shearers and give it to the men whom I don't know even where they come from?" This is actually this is how you should respond, right? Somebody shows up and you're like, I got to pay my workers. I mean, what am I going to take the money I'm going to use to pay my workers? I'm going to pay these guys I don't even know who they are? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? Why do these guys where are they getting the money from, right? So this is what you would typically respond to, unless you understood, right? That is that David thought that this guy was going to get it, but then the guy doesn't. So obviously then David, being a good person, responds, well, it's okay, Nabal. I understand. You have to pay your workers, and I just was saying maybe you could spare us a little bit, and everything's fine, and I love you, and may God be with you. Goodbye. Actually, David doesn't say any of that. What David says is, Verse 13, every man strap on his sword. We're going to war. We're going to kill this guy and burn down everything and take what we want. David's a raider. I mean, this is amazing, right? I mean, you don't really hear much about this David, right? But I mean, if I was watching a movie and someone was pulling these tactics, I'd expect them to say, "Hey, tell me something, I've never burned down your restaurant. Your restaurant's just fine. I need some money if you want it to be in the same place it is tomorrow. Or, you could do what you want." This is Godfather stuff. This is totally mafia talk. And these guys strap on their swords, and David also strapped on his sword. He's guilty of this just like the rest of them. And about 400 men went up for David, while 200 men remained with the baggage. They have so much stuff. David's men have so much stuff that 200 men need to stay behind to guard the baggage. While 400 men, this is an army in the ancient world. 400 armed men, this isn't like 5 guys or something. 400 men went up while 200 keep David's stuff. This is how David got all that stuff, by the way. He did this lots of times. But then one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, remember the smart woman? Well, here she comes. The guy says, well, David sent these messengers. He's kind of telling the story about what happened to Abigail. So then verse 18, Abigail hurried and took her 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready to be dressed, that is to be cooked, or to be assembled for cooking, 5 measures of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs. So she gets all this stuff that they would want. She loaded it on donkeys, and she said, go out there, take the stuff out there. And she rode on her donkey, and she came under cover of the mountain. David and his men came towards her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely it was in vain that I protected all this fellow had in the wilderness so that nothing was missed and belonged to him. But he has returned me evil for good. David's like, why did this guy make me fight him, God do so to David and more also if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. I have something to tell you. This is a bit rude, but the rudeness is in the Hebrew. The King James Version is more accurate to the Hebrew. Instead of saying, I don't, what David is saying, if we translate it quite literally, is that may God hurt me if I leave so much as one who pisses against the wall of all who belong to him. The pisseth against the wall. That's from the KJV, but that really is the true that's what the Hebrew says. Someone who pees against a wall. That is a male, like someone who stands up to pee. This is how David talks, right? And he's going to kill all the boys in the family so that there will be no one to continue the line. This is a brutal threat. I mean, this should make us feel uncomfortable. And it should be amazing to us that this remains in the text. David somehow wasn't able to sanitize his portrait in the Bible. This would come right out. This is a pretty negative story of David. But it was left in. That should be interesting. We'll come back to that point later on too. So then Abigail, is worried, right? And she says, my husband's an idiot. I'm sorry about this. Please have mercy on us, and so on. And verse 26, now then, my Lord, she's talking to David, as Yahweh lives and as you yourself live, since Yahweh has restrained you from blood guilt and taking of vengeance, and so on, now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be like Nabal. So in other words, you thank God that you have been so kind as to not hurt us. This is a woman who's dealt with some abusers before. And David acts like an abuser in verse 32 when he answers her. David said to Abigail, blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you who have kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. Thank goodness you had the sense to give me what I wanted so that I didn't have to hurt you. If you're caught in any relationship that uses this kind of bargaining that requires you to say thank you for not hurting me, that's an abusive relationship, and it's something to protect yourself from. David is not cast in a good light here. And then afterwards, Abigail came to Nabal, verse 36. He was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. He got very drunk and so on, and then he died. He just happened to die. David didn't do it. David didn't kill Nabal, but Nabal happened to die. And then that woman, Abigail, right, the woman that David really liked a lot, she just happened to all of a sudden be single and available. And then verse 39, David heard Nabal was dead. He said, "Oh, blessed be the Lord who has judged the case of Nabal's insult to me and has kept back a servant from evil. I didn't even have to kill him. And now I'll have Abigail as my wife." And she joined him. Michal obviously was not very happy about this. So all to say, this is David. This is who we're dealing with. And Abigail proves herself wise beyond this as well. David is also wise because in the next chapter he doesn't kill King Saul. Now, why doesn't he kill King Saul? King Saul a couple of times comes hunting for David in the wilderness, and David knows the wilderness better than Saul does. And David survives. Saul survives too. Why doesn't David kill Saul when he has the chance? Well, because he says, I am not going to touch the Lord's anointed. Because David wants to be king too, after Saul. And David does not want to start a tradition in ancient Israel of killing kings, because he will be next. In most kingdoms of the ancient world, kings had to fastidiously protect themselves from assassination. Assassination was just a daily part of life in the ancient world. Kings would get poisoned, they would get statues pushed on top of them. Not kidding. That's a real thing that happened to several ancient kings. They were under threat all the time because people were out to get them so they could take their place. Or anyone who the king had harmed in some way was trying to get people in the court to kill the king and get back for them, or to get them their land back, or whatever it is. All these different things that the king could do could be undone by the king's death. But David doesn't want to start that tradition in ancient Israel. So it's really, it's in a good way self-serving, right? David doesn't want, but this actually is an amazing thing that in the south, in Judah, as opposed to the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, when they split, in Judah there is this tradition that the kings don't get assassinated. That doesn't always hold. But in the north, you'll see kings get assassinated all the time. In the south, there's this reverence for the line of King David that continues throughout, and in part that's because of David himself. So we can also, you can see all these different things, but you can see David now in this other light. And then David, of course, becomes a lord of the Philistines, and at this major battle, he just happens to not be present because the Philistines didn't trust him to come to battle with them. So David stayed home. And David, by the way, in chapter 30, verse 26, David is giving out tons of money and presents to the elders of Judah from all of this stuff that he's stolen, being being one of the lords of Ziklag, the Philistine city. So he's buying some friends in Judah. It's a very savvy political move. And in battle, Jonathan and Saul die, and David wasn't there. At least that's what the story says, right? This is a tradition of David not being there for the deaths of people that really have been bugging him, like Nabal. Now watch this tradition continue. So in chapter 1, David hears about Saul and Jonathan's death from the messenger who claims that he killed actually Saul. And David says, "You killed the Lord's anointed. Let's execute you publicly." And the messenger gets executed, because David wants to protect this idea that we're not going to harm the Lord's anointed, and because he wants to make it clear, I wasn't there when Saul and Jonathan died, because everyone might suspect that David was behind it, right? So in chapter 2, after all of this, then David asks God, inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And God said, "Go up." This would have been like the dice, the Urim and Thummim on the priest's breastplate. That was understood to be this kind of, when you ask God these questions, God might answer through those dice. So God says, "Go up." David says, "Well, where should I go up?" And God said, "To Hebron, the city in the south in Judah." This will function as David's home base for a while. So David went up there. Remember, he gave just tons of money to the Judahite elders in Hebron, right? Okay, so David goes up there along with his wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up the men who were with him, everyone from his household, and they settled in the towns of Hebron. So David comes there with his army, and all his men settle down. So now he's got an army there at Hebron. Then the people of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So this is David's second anointing, right? But this is just over the house of Judah. He just becomes king in the south, right? So this is actually a really, really important moment here. Sorry. Really important moment. So Saul is dead now. Sorry, this is a He image, a Chinese Christian artist who has these amazing images using Chinese opera or Chinese theater and the kind of stage direction, the stage costumes, stage makeup that they have there. But here's Saul chasing David. But so David ends up, of course, joining the Philistines, as I said. Sorry, I'm a little behind on my slides. David joins the Philistines. But then when David becomes king in Hebron, Saul is dead. Now, what's going to happen? Why isn't he king of all of Israel, right? He's just really king of Judah here. Well, it's because he knows that Saul's family, Saul's a Benjaminite, his family and the northern tribes are more associated with Benjamin, with Saul than they are with him. So David gets a power base in the south very firmly here. And you can imagine maybe that these elders maybe don't want David to be king, but now he's got this army and he's parked himself in Hebron, right? So David does say, "We're going to, because you showed this loyalty, verse 7, "Therefore let your hands be strong, be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So that's his statement, right? But then in the north, we know that this is not going to be they're not going to anoint David king in the north. Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbaal, son of Saul. Ish means man, so Ishbaal means a man of Baal. Baal can function as a title for Yahweh. It means Lord. So in any event, it could be Baal, the god Baal, the Canaanite god. So in any event, the man of God, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. There he made him king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and over all Israel. That means the northern tribes. So the northern tribes, like Ephraim, they now have their own king, and that's Saul. So Abner is the general for Saul, and he knows that his life depends upon there being a king that he can serve that's opposite David, right? So verse 10, Ishbaal, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. That was it. So we'll see. But the house of Judah followed David. So here's the split. The kingdom splits here. David unifies it again, but for now it's split. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So then there's this battle at Gibeon. Here's the pool of Gibeon, actually archaeologically found, where they line up in halves, and Joab versus Abner, right? The two sides. Joab is David's general, Abner is Saul's general, but then Ishbaal's general, and they line up and they have this kind of hand-to-hand combat in this pool. Well, this is that actual pool, the fierce fighting in the pool. But in any event, in chapter 3, Abner does defect. David gets the general from Saul to defect to him. Of course, Joab ends up killing Abner, right? There's not space for two main generals, right? So Joab feels attacked in a way that Abner may take his spot and he may assassinate him. So Joab kills Abner. So this is this will come back later in 1 Kings when we see basically David's death and what happens in the aftermath. So, and even Abner wants to negotiate with David and become his general, and he's going to deliver some stuff to him, right? So Abner comes over and switches sides, and then starting in verse 22, we have the story where Joab kills Abner. But look at verse 26 at the end of that. David didn't know about it. David did not know that this happened, right? The main general for Saul's army just happens to die, assassinated by David's general, but David didn't know. David didn't order it. David really kept his hands clean in this one. And you can see this because in verse 37, so all the people and all Israel understood that day that the king had no part in the killing of Abner, son of Ner. Just like he had no part in Jonathan and David's death, just like he had no part in Nabal's death. And then chapter 4, what's next? Ishbaal gets assassinated. When Saul's son Ishbaal heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed and all Israel was dismayed. And then we hear a little bit story of Mephibosheth, David's other son. But notice in verse 6, these guys come and assassinate Ishbaal. Now verse 7, now they had come into the house while he was lying on his couch in his bedchamber. They attacked him, killed him, and beheaded him. Then they took his head and they traveled all the way. They got to prove that they actually killed him, right? So they think that David's going to celebrate them for this. In verse 8, they brought the head of Ishbaal to David at Hebron. They said, here's the head of Hebron. And David says, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when the one who had told me, see, Saul is dead, thought he was bringing good news, remember all the way back to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. This was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more then when wicked men have killed a righteous man? So then David kills the assassins. It's pretty clean. David didn't have anything to do with Ishbaal. David didn't have anything to do with Ishbaal's death. And David executed the assassins, just like he executed the assassin of Saul and Jonathan. And then chapter 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, look, we're your bone and flesh. Don't hurt us anymore. For some time while Saul was king is over us, you were the general. You let us out and let us back in. And then God said you should be shepherd of the people. Okay, let's do it. So then verse 3, all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. Notice, it's David's home base in the far south of Judah in Hebron. All the elders have to come down there, right? This is so that David doesn't hurt them. So then they anointed David king over all of Israel, not just the south, not just Judah. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 40 years. And at Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And then Jerusalem, he reigned the remainder. So then verse 6. The king has been marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. So David finally becomes king after all his political rivals are assassinated, and he had nothing to do with it, right? Absolutely nothing. I'm not sure I believe that exactly, but what I can say is that David has been a masterful political player here. That he's worked it out so that the only person left on the scene that anyone really trusts to have the ability to lead them all, especially militarily against any threats from the Philistines, is David. And then immediately David goes and attacks Jerusalem. So why does David immediately go and attack Jerusalem and make it his home, his new home? You can see here it was owned by the Jebusites. So there were still Canaanites in the land at this time, right around the year 1000 BC when David becomes king. Jerusalem is a major city. Well, it's pretty small actually, but all cities were small at that point in time. But David is able to attack it through the sewers. It's kind of an amazing story. It's a fascinating one. But David occupied it, verse 9, and David occupied the stronghold, named it the City of David. So there was like a fortress at the top of this hill. The hill is named Zion, by the way. The city is Jerusalem. It was named that before David took it over. And David begins to consolidate his power there in this city. Now, think about this. It's genius that he makes, political genius, that he makes his city, that this city his capital. The reason is this. If he makes his capital in Hebron, way in the south, he's far away from the action of most Israelites who live in the northern part of Israel. The northern highland area is the center of Israelite life. There's the majority of Israelite population there. The Jezreel Valley, where a lot of the major cities are and so on, and a lot of the major farmland is. Hebron's in a desert area, way in the south. doesn't work well for political usage, but also there's a lot of lords of Hebron, right? There are these elders of Hebron. There's a lot of people who lived there for a long time. They might not like David. They might try to poison his dinner, right, to get rid of him. But instead, and David can't go to the north and live there, like take over a city in the north or something, because they'll just poison him and kill him too. So instead, what David does is he finds a city that is not occupied by any Israelites. He takes it over. He conquers it, a Canaanite city. He takes over the Canaanite bureaucracy. They've been kings there for thousands of years. They've had writing for many hundreds of years. They've been communicating with the king of Egypt on a regular basis. We have letters from Jerusalem that were written from the king of Jerusalem well before ancient Israel existed. From the year 1400 BC, we've got letters from from Jerusalem when it was a Canaanite city. There's a well-established bureaucracy. There's a temple that existed there. There's an apparatus for running a temple. There's a bureaucracy of scribes. There's accountants who've lived there for a long time, right? People who know how to grow food in this area, in the valleys where Jerusalem. So that is to say that they have a lot of knowledge and wisdom and power about how to run a bureaucracy. And the Israelites don't. They haven't had kings. So David conquers this neutral site right on the border of the northern tribes and the southern tribes, like exactly on the border. And he cleans it of Jebusites, right? And then he's able to occupy it with only people that he chooses. Only people that he trusts get to live in this city. It is now a perfect political city, balanced between the northern kingdom and the northern tribes and the southern tribes to try to create a unified kingdom. He's going to centralize worship there. You'll notice he brings the ark into Jerusalem next, right? Dancing and so on. And Michal gets upset with him. And he's, just going nuts. He's only wearing, it seems, this ceremonial priestly garb, which he's not a priest, even though he sacrifices some things. All to say the priestly lines weren't perhaps entirely in charge of what David was doing at the time. We'll see Solomon perform sacrifices too. But the Lord of hosts was enthroned upon the cherubim in 2 Samuel 6, verse 2. Remember, the ark is the mobile throne of God. He takes that throne and he brings it up to his own city now. Of course, he doesn't get to make the temple yet, and so on. We'll talk about that in our next segment. But just to say, David takes this mobile image of God's presence that moved around between the tribes, and he parks it in his own city, Jerusalem. That is his city, the city of David, where his stronghold is, right? This is a political way of unifying the north and the south, but also it is focused on David's own power and consolidating his own power. So hopefully that's a bit of a different take on David than you may have heard of before. Perhaps it's a bit, I don't know. It might feel sacrilegious. It might feel like we're taking down like a statue of David here. But all to say, we shouldn't have statues that we worship of biblical characters anyway. We shouldn't look to any biblical character to be the witness to what it's like to be, or the model for what it's like to be a hero, or what it's like to be a leader. David has his problems, just as we all do. Perhaps his problems are even outmoded compared to some of ours. But one thing that's important here is to see that David is not just a problem. David also is someone who believes wholeheartedly in Yahweh and trusts everything to Yahweh, and does, in fact, in some way, at least up to this point in the story, represent those people who are outcast, those people who have become debt slaves, those people who have run away from these oppressive structures and have found him in the wilderness and have found in him a champion. Also, they found someone who plays protection games like he's in the mafia and steals things from rich people like Nabal. This is a complicated story with complicated ethics. And we're going to see in the next section, we're going to take some time to talk about what David does, especially starting in 2 Samuel 7 with the covenant that God makes. But then there's a near immediate pivot to a decline or a downfall of David, which involves his own completely immoral acts, which are reprehensible, and it also involves his family, which revolts against him. We'll see that throughout. David has the same tension that we've seen, this tension between wanting to take things that are not his, to use other people for his own gain and his own glory, but then also this fierce courage that Yahweh is going to be there for him. These things are also melded with this strange humility that appears only at times, but that also is, I think, crucially important to who David is and the legacy that David leaves for us today. Okay, so in the next module, we'll touch on all that.